All right. So we're recording. So anyway, like I said, next week or this week, tonight Islam, next week Sikhism, and we'll be done for this semester, so to speak. And then next semester we're going to do the Book of Revelation, which we need to do every so often so that we can figure out when the end of the world is coming. Right? That's revelatory, right? It's supposed to, or maybe the apocalypse is better name for it. But in any case, so we'll be off for a while, a short time, and then back again the third week in January. So let's get busy tonight. Islam. This one I've been thinking about for several weeks, knowing that it was coming, considering some of the events we have going on in the world today. And Islam, quite frankly, is a religion that I have always, for various and sundry reasons, have admired. You know, there was always this idea, and I mean, I've grown up with through this, with talking about those that were in Islam and that were terrorists. And we've all heard that, right? We've all, and that's been around for a long time. And the fact is true that there are those that are terrorists in Islam, and though there are those that are terrorists in other groups as well. And when it's easy to condemn one religion that's different than Christianity, but if you look at the history of Christianity, which we covered in some respects, you realize that Christians have been killing Christians for close to 1,700 years anyway, with abandon, and many millions killed in the last century or so. So it's there's much blame to go around. As far as Islam is concerned, like I said, there is much to be admired, and we're going to talk about it. Those that are considered terrorists in Islam, and we've seen some of these, the Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and some of these others. There are essentially 1 billion Muslims on the face of the earth, like Christianity, about 1 billion, and 1 billion is a big number. Some said that there's 10% were these terrorists, which would still bring it to like 100 million. I don't know that there are that many, and again, there's blame to go around on all of these different things. But those that are Muslims that I've dealt with in the past, and I've dealt very closely with some, were not those type. They were these are, of course, some that I dealt with were Kurds, but they were Muslim and coming from Kurdistan and so on. Others I've dealt with, always very, very kind, very gentle, very, almost loving, so to speak. And we never had a great chance to talk about their religion, but I deal with Islam and the rise of Islam in the classes I teach. That's in the Western Civ 2, which I teach to 10th graders. And we deal with the rise of Islam and so on. And there's other reasons. Islam, one of the great things about Islam, there's the rise. We'll talk about the rise of it. But in the long run, when the classical civilization collapsed, and it collapsed greatly in the West, it would survive for quite a while in the East. That would also collapse after quite some time. In fact, it would be Muslims that would take the city of Constantinople or whatever, 1453 and so on. But long before that, they had collected and preserved much of the classical civilization, much of the Greek texts. And in fact, they were fascinated by them, and they recopied them and copied them, and they preserved them. And when those were essentially lost in the West, and there was, much later in the time of Charlemagne, many of these books were, we almost lost all of it in the West. And Charlemagne, with he was he was a great scholar, and Charlemagne asked him to, essentially they built a university and they brought scholars from around Europe and so on, and to preserve these books. But the Muslims had already done that. And the great center of learning later was the city of Cordoba in Spain. It was an amazing place. And early on, Islam was they had to, it was one of these things where they just like very quickly expanded from essentially Spain all the way to essentially the borders of China and even into China in some instances. But Cordoba was the great place of learning. Later, there would be Baghdad and some of these places, but Cordoba was a city lit at nights. At night the streets were lit. There was streams and fountains and stuff that ran through the city. Great libraries, great places where they preserve these works. There's been a book or two written about Cordoba, and of course, early on, Jews and Christians were essentially, they weren't forced to be to come under the to accept Islam. They were what they were called dhimmis, dhimmis, which essentially is second-class citizens. So they had a tax that they had to pay, but they were allowed to to worship in the way that they chose. In fact, many Christians and Jews served in high offices throughout Islam, throughout the different countries, all the way from Spain throughout this great empire, if you will, early on. And Cordoba is as I mentioned, is one of the great cities. It would later be destroyed by another sect of Islam that decided that these people and these Muslims in Cordoba were not following the Sharia law, not following the precepts of Muhammad and so on. And of course, then the Catholics would come in and destroy the rest of it. What was not destroyed by these Muslims from North Africa. But in any case, it was they had preserved these works, and much of it was that they had preserved was eventually copied by a man by the name of Gerard of Cremona, who was from Italy, who copied these texts he translated. He came looking for one book, the Almagest, and then he found it, but he also found hundreds of others. And so he had to learn Arabic, and Arabic, of course, is the language of Islam. Wherever you might be, it is Arabic. And he stayed for 30 years, learned Arabic, translated over 70 texts, and sent them all to Italy, and they would later be used to fuel the Renaissance. So you see that in Islam then would go from that point on, as we'll discuss a little later, to become one of the great, we have many things that come, with mathematics and science and literature and so on. They had the greatness of that faith would extend through another 400 or 500 years until about the 11th or 12th century, and then would come the steady downfall of the civilization. It would, of course, exist throughout all that time to the present day, obviously, but and it would, much like Christianity, there's a lot of infighting between the different sects of Islam, but from the time of Al-Ghazali, who we'll talk about briefly tonight, they great scholars, and great inventions, great art, literature, and that would come out of out of Islam. And so we'll talk about those things, and then why the great hatred and some that many have for the West and so on. We'll talk about those things as we go along. Hello, come in. So let's talk a little bit about what was going on before the birth of Islam. Essentially late 6th, early 7th centuries. The Arabian Peninsula, the places where you have Medina, and it is in the Middle East and in South. It was obviously a rather desolate area, and very sparsely populated. There were two great powers in this part of the world. One was the Byzantine Empire, otherwise known as the Eastern Roman Empire, that had survived the fall of the West. And they would survive until about 1453, as I mentioned, when they would be taken, the city would be taken. And of course, the other one was the Persian Empire, the Sassanians. And mostly of course, the Byzantine was Christian. The Sassanians, the Persian Empire was Zoroastrians, which we talked about here a week or two ago. They did not like each other, and they had been in, fighting, conflict with each other for centuries, and they were getting ready at the moment to enter into a conflict which would essentially almost destroy either side. Certainly would weaken them greatly, and they and it mostly was because of religion, because of different ideas and stuff that they had, and so they were ready to fight and ready to go at each other. And just about this same time, Muhammad would come about. But previously, as far as the religion, the Arabians, these pre-Islamic Arabians, were animists, polytheists. They were certainly not a very pious people, before Islam, and they believed in these what we call, you've heard of genies, the genies. They were kind of indistinct, and there were godlings that were here and there, and so on. Some of this you see in some of the literature that comes down, but above all that, very far up in there someplace, was one that they paid a little attention to, a god, the high god, whose name was Allah. And usually you emphasize the second Allah. And interestingly enough, this is it's the Arabic form. Allah is the Arabic form of the Semitic name for the high god, of the Jews and so on, the Hebrews. It's very closely related to Elohim. And so we obviously know the word Elohim, talked about that in several places. And so, Allah is a contraction of the Arabic words al and ilah, which together mean the God. Essentially, that's what it means, the God. Elohim is formed from the Hebrew word Elo, or Elah, Elo, God, and the masculine plural im, Elohim. It's plural, of course. And so it's Allah is in fact, the God. You'll have people who are Arabic and Turkish Christians use the same name. These Christians use Allah as the name of their God, because to them it is. And in fact, it's Joseph, just start to say Joseph Smith. Muhammad, talks about the fact that this Allah was the same God of the Christians and the Jews, because there is, and of course there was, obviously they're going to be, he's going to clarify that, but it's, it doesn't, Jesus is mentioned in the Quran as a great prophet. And in fact, he is the one who will come at the end of days, the end of the world, and so on. He is not in the Quran, he's not the Son of God, but he is a great prophet. And so but Allah is well, we'll talk about him in a minute, but he essentially is in many ways unknowable, without body parts or passions. It was, to use kind of a Christian idea. And yet when they describe him, they tend to give him passions in a way, a loving God, and so on. But we'll go through that as we come to it. And so the things were beginning to change in the part of the world where Muhammad lived, or would live. He's what they had, I don't have a map here, but if you can imagine what we're looking at, there's trade routes that run through this part of the world, coming from the south, and some would come from the far east and down into these places. And they begin to run into, they're coming from places like Yemen and Ethiopia, Somalia, even as far as India. This part of the world, as the West, of course, had fallen, that part of the West tended to be, it was the old Roman Empire, was very agrarian, no gold and silver there. It was, no trade, but the East still had the cities that were very vibrant because of the trade routes and so on, very, very wealthy. And a lot of this wealth is going to start to trickle down into places like Medina and the cities in the far south. And there were many, they mentioned just in this book, there was a a prophet that was mentioned in the Quran. His name is Hud or Hud, better Hud, Hud. There's a lot of parallels between this prophet and a prophet that we know well, whose name is Lehi, interestingly enough. And it says, this one scholar mentions, says the record of Lehi, a pre-Islamic prophet of Arabia by Mormon belief, coincides with what Islamic traditions tell us about such prophets. We know Lehi was a merchant, and of course there's a lot of this going on in this part of the world. We don't know exactly everything that he dealt with, but metalsmithing and things like this probably, but probably more than that. And he traveled a lot that we know is probably into Egypt. Certainly he would probably be down south and so on. And Lehi, has probably been prophesying for some time. And so could be the, where he was. But in the place of where he might have traveled, especially as he's traveling out of Jerusalem and heading to the east, there was a brackish well. There was, of course, the ancient oasis of Mecca, and kind of a brackish well there, which was called Zamzam. And Mecca had been around for a very long time, an old city, historic city. The idea was that Ishmael, the son of Abraham, had lived there for like most of his life. And Abraham, of course, was born not too far. There's this idea that he was far in the south, Abraham. Others say no, far in the north, but both places have the same name, where Abraham may have been born. But in any case, the idea is that they're both born in an area that's very much the same as far as either one was concerned. And so Abraham is one who tried to get his father and others to let go of idolatry. A funny story that comes out of that is that Abraham one day is left alone at the house, been working with his father and others to get them to let go of idolatry. They wouldn't do it. So while they were gone, probably not a true story, but it's an ancient story. While his father is gone, he gathers all of the idols, puts them in the middle of the floor, and sets them on fire, burns them all, burns them up. When his father comes home, he's obviously very irritated, very upset. And he says, "What happened here? What did you do?" And he says, really nothing. He says, "The idols, while you were gone, began to argue and set great flames to each other and burned each other up, destroyed each other." And his father said, "They can't do that. They can't do those things." And he said, "Exactly, they can't. In fact, they can't do anything, They can't do anything." Well, whether it's true or not, I don't know. But the rabbis came up with some of these things that were interesting, and it's just a story to tell exactly what Abraham thought of idol worship. Well, in any case, Mecca in the 6th century comes about. When it opens, was beginning to acquire this great wealth. And as they acquired great wealth because of these trade routes and so on that are coming, they and of course in the center of Mecca they had a place, an ancient what do you call it, ancient center, a shrine that was called the Kaaba, K-A-apostrophe-A-B-A, Kaaba. In the center of it has a stone which appears to be a meteorite, something that's very sacred, and that Abraham himself had touched. And this was something that had been very sacred for a long time, but involved with polytheistic worship in the center of Mecca. And so they had a group, one of the tribes. There were many tribes of those Arabs. And by the way, of course, that are all supposedly descended from Ishmael. Okay, many of these tribes. In fact, there was, just as you have, Jacob had 12 sons, Ishmael supposedly had 12 sons as well. And they all came, so they're different tribes. And you'll have those tribes down to the present day. They're still there. They stay very close to that. So they inside the Kaaba were treaties, copies of treaties that had been made between the different tribes, also idols and so on of these different godlings, as sometimes called. But as these wealth came down, changes occurred. People became these particularly one tribe, Quraysh, Quraysh. One tribe became particularly wealthy in Mecca, and they wealth became everything to them. And though the old tribal relationship that you would take care of people like widows, orphans, these people, you would take care of them, but as wealth came into and this is emphasized in Islam, as wealth came into this part of the world, they left off caring for the widows and the orphans and so there was great distress there. And the reason this is stressed in Islam is because the Prophet Muhammad is known as one who always had a great love and care and concern for widows and orphans and so on. And so so it's something that he comes across that would come across in later on, as we'll see. The other people that were there were Jews. As the people in Mecca began to look at other religions, there was only two that you could really choose from: Jewish, the Jewish religion, or Christianity. The Jews really weren't interested in converts. Even today, they'll say, we kind of warn people away. I think I mentioned that here recently. They kind of warn people away because, if you're Christian, you've got 10 commandments. If you're going to become a Jew, you're talking like a whole lot more, like over 600. So maybe, so they kind of warn them away that this may not be the thing that you'd be looking for. And so the Jews weren't interested. And then if you were to become Christian, that would identify you with the Byzantine Empire, which was considered an enemy. There was no love lost between the Arabs and the Byzantine Empire. And of course, that no love lost will be one of the reasons why they will expand so quickly, because they hated the Byzantine Empire. So you're making kind of a political connection there. They're not going to do that. So this is kind of the things that's going on, and people are seeking for something else. But the society, as far as we'll see, as Muhammad is concerned, is falling into, it's just degrading themselves with this just a desire for wealth, turning away from the widows, the children, those who are in need of help, and so on. And so that's the atmosphere that's going on when Muhammad is born. He was born about 570 AD. He was orphaned in early childhood and was cared for first by his grandfather and then by his uncle, whose name was Abu Talib. He was exposed, of course, to everything that's going on in Mecca, and he would. The record, I mean, they don't know a great deal about his early life, but he wasn't interested in mentioning a lot of this. But he overcame whatever. I mean, obviously, great disadvantages. Born an orphan in a society like this, lost his parents, raised by his grandfather first, who then died, and then his uncle, who was there. He overcomes these things, and they mention by his virtue, by his capability, and then becomes a camel driver, and these large caravans, again, that are traveling throughout this part of the world. The particular caravan that he works with for, it appears, some years, the owner of that caravan died, and sometime afterwards, Muhammad would marry the now widow of this owner of this caravan, a woman by the name of Khadijah, very wealthy, obviously, and but it appears to have been a good match, and she was older than he was, but a good match, and so and by the way, she would be his first convert, which makes sense, does it not? And so he wasn't the only one. There were others in this society who were called the Hunafa, Hunafa, Hunafa. These were those that were seeking after something better, and they were praying and fasting They really wanted a monotheistic. They were looking for a monotheistic God, if you will. Both of the religions that were in the area, both Judaism and Christianity, were monotheistic. So they were looking for that, and obviously Muhammad would provide that to them soon. And so he doesn't appear to have forgotten his childhood. And as I mentioned, he was particularly sensitive to children, to widows, to orphans. That would make sense, being an orphan himself. So in about 610 AD, it was Muhammad's, again, he was one who was seeking God, seeking a faith, a religion. It was his habit to spend time in a cave near his home, in prayer, in meditation, or whatever, and it was something he did maybe every day, every other day, but it was quite often. And at one point, when he is doing this, carrying out his religious devotions, that came what's called the Night of Power and Excellence, when the angel Gabriel came to him in a vision and to deliver a revelation, one that would be, of course, and actually it was actually the revelation of the Quran. By the way, the Quran usually is spelled Quran. It's more anglicized as Koran, Quran, but Quran is the bed name. And the angel demanded that Muhammad read. He would say, "Read, in the name of thy Lord who createth man from a clot. Read, and thy Lord is the most bounteous, who teaches by the pen, teaches man that which he knew not." Okay, that which he knew not. And the idea was to read, to go for it. So Muhammad, of course, rushes home, very excited, not sure what to believe. I mean, this is something very new, but this would continue. He did receive what he called repeated visions in the cave, and he was called essentially, and felt that he needed to go forth and proclaim a religion of the absolute God, the creator, the potentate, the judge of the world. He began to look at himself as a true prophet, an apostle of Allah, a messenger of the one and only God, already known to the Jews and the Christians. Okay, this is not to be a God that was different, though he would explain that much of what they believed, not so much the Jews, but certainly the Christians, what they believed was incorrect. That his idea of who God is and was is the most pure, the best idea of God. So also during this period, there occurred what Muhammad, the night vision or the night journey. The accounts of this are pretty different. I mean, there's several different accounts of it, somewhat different from one to the other. But the basic story is that Muhammad was taken during the night from Central Arabia to the holy city of Jerusalem. Okay, and there he led several of the ancient prophets in prayer, and on the Temple Mount, essentially exactly, of course, according to tradition, where Abraham was going to offer not Jacob but Ishmael. Okay, as far as the Quran is concerned, and the tradition, it wasn't Jacob, but it was Ishmael on that stone. And of course, it was where now the Jerusalem temple would be built, or the Temple of Solomon would be built, but also later the Al-Aqsa Mosque that is presently there, that was built there essentially 1,600 years ago. Beautiful building, by the way, just a tremendous building. I show a video to my students at Jaroslav Janacek, or whatever, is a famous artist and commentator and so on, great art on the ancient art, but he does one on Islam and shows the inside of this Dome of the Rock, which I'd like to see one day. It is a beautiful thing, beautiful, beautiful building. been there a long time, and of course, it's built on this rock. There's a cave underneath the rock that's been there forever. And but anyway, this is, and by the way, as I mentioned before, Jerusalem is the center of the world. It's called the navel of the world, of three great religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And so the in fact, something I had here that like I said, great world. Islam is maybe I mentioned, maybe I didn't. It essentially means submission to God, to Allah. So in any case, he has this he led several ancient prophets in prayer, and then he ascended through the seven heavens into the presence of Allah. And it's, again, from that same spot, seven heavens, which is interesting. Christianity doesn't go with seven normally. We tend to expand that number out, to more than one, certainly, at least three. And there may be different gradations within those. So we could kind of agree with that, could we not? And so you have the Dome of the Rock, or the Al-Aqsa mosques. It's and so he's in Mecca. He's after this happens, he goes back to Mecca. He's there, but his position there becomes rather untenable. People are not accepting this faith. They're not accepting his teaching. He's persecuted. He's essentially not quite driven, but from the city. But what happens is that he has a group of men came on a pilgrimage. There was a city called Yathrib, Yathrib, and asked Muhammad to come and ask as an arbiter in a confrontation they were having, squabbles in their town and so on. So he agreed, and he and what few followers he has, he went to the town, and the city eventually was one that was called, it had a different name, but essentially it's Medina. Okay, very famous Medina. It is called the Hijra, which takes place. This is in 622, and of course the Muslim calendar is dated from this year, 622. That's where they started, and so he goes there. So it's it's called the flight from Mecca to Medina, and it occurs in the night when the moon was in its quarter. And so in its quarter, so you've noticed a lot of the Islamic flags have the quarter moon. Okay, this is when they start their calendar, and of course the moon is very significant of this event. And then Muslims usually look at this flight, so to speak. It's a turning point as far as Muhammad is concerned, because he's very much in Mecca, kind of he's rejected as far as a preacher, as a minister. He's rejected, he's sent out. But when he goes to Yathrib, he's now become a statesman, a diplomat, a judge. He's going to determine, between these people. Obviously he has a reputation, must have had a reputation. These people come to him and ask him to come to their city and you meditate, or arbitrate between us. And so he does. And when he does that, he's already started with some revelations, and these revelations, somebody described it as the revelations he has at first are like Isaiah, for example. Once he goes to Medina, the revelations he have are more like Leviticus. Okay, and in fact, much of the Quran is kind of it's like Leviticus. It's laws, and it's procedure, and it's these kind of things, how to live, how they should live as a nation, as a people, how they should live as far as their relationship, if you will, with Allah. And so you begin to see that. Somebody mentioned, he says, it's like a change from Joseph Smith's King Follett discourse, one of the great discourses ever, to maybe one of Brigham Young's sermons on irrigation canals. Okay, I've never read that. It doesn't sound real interesting, does it? But that's kind of, that's that's Brigham Young, that's kind of the way it is. And so you have a lot of that. It's in the Quran. It's how to live, the life and the things that you should or should not do. And by the way, the Quran is essentially just a little shorter than the New Testament as far as words and so on. But there, remember hearing quite many years ago that especially there are youth, they have contests. And the contests are for these youth to memorize the entire Quran. Okay. Imagine memorizing the entire New Testament. But there's a lot of youth that do this. They actually memorize the entire Quran. That's a feat. That's something, right? That is something. So Muhammad then, of course, once he does this, his reputation goes forward and he becomes obviously quite successful. Within a few years, he's able to return back to the city of Mecca. He essentially takes the city, which some look at as a kind of a militaristic event. But in any case, there's no bloodshed. So you can't really say that it's fully militarily but it's, they look at it as takes the city. And he makes the Kaaba becomes the center of worship in that city. And it is, in fact, it's considered the center of worship of the universe, the Kaaba and Mecca itself. The holiest of cities to Muslims. Medina is the second holiest, and of course, Jerusalem the third. So anyway, in any case, and of course, becomes very successful. He has people that join and come into Islam from all over this part of the world. But in 632, and there's a question as to when actually his revelations are written down. Did it happen in his lifetime or did it happen shortly after his lifetime? It was unusual. I mean, we just talked about memorizing things. It wasn't unusual for those. I mean, he did, it appears, have some scribes that were close to him, so they may have been writing these things down. There's others that think that they were written down after his death. And that would be not unusual. You had people that could memorize these things and did memorize them. This was, how do you think we got Homer's Iliad? This is long after Homer's Iliad, but people still did this. And so in any case, in 632, Muhammad suffers from a short fever and dies suddenly, unexpectedly, in the arms of his wife, Aisha. It was his favorite wife within his harem. He was 62 years of age. So it's difficult to understand sometimes, though I think maybe we as members of the church understand this a little better, the way Muslims feel about the Prophet Muhammad. He's called the seal of the prophets. I mean, his is the last revelation, of the prophets. There can be no more. And Muslims think that many people outside Islam don't understand recognize the deep love that Muslims have for the Prophet. They bless his name, they invoke his name in conversations, celebrate his birthday. He is what's called the beautiful model of behavior in all things. And then pious Muslims, of course, and there are pious ones and there are not so many pious ones and so on, but they strive to emulate his mode of dress, his style of grooming, his table manners, his manner of prayer, his gentleness and kindness to women, children, and animals. Now, do all follow that? Well, no. But like any faith, not everybody is as pious as others within the faith. So the Quran is something that was, of course, it is the sacred book it's considered a book that was eternal in the first place, that it was in the place where Allah exists, so to speak. Remember, Allah has no body. Okay, he's nothing like that. But the Quran has been around essentially forever, and you've probably seen some of I forgot to bring a copy of the Quran that Dever Langhoff. Don't tell him, you all. Some of those of you who take his class, don't tell him I forgot. But he gave me a copy of the Quran, large copy, If I think about it, I'll bring it next week and show it to you. But the language itself and the way they do it's like calligraphy. It's beautiful. I mean, and you see it. They don't have pictures. I mean, they'll have pictures of animals and they don't usually have pictures of people, but it's animals, it's nature, and so on. But you'll see sometimes in the mosque and other places, and beautiful picture of the calligraphy, the verses from the Quran. It's a beautiful written language, and Arabic, and it's and so this is something that they emphasize. It is, and so it's you'll see it throughout the walls of mosques, apartment buildings, schools, stores, even just verses from the Quran, but beautiful language and beautiful written language. The it's like Muhammad, you have the Quran, Jesus, you have the Christ, you have the Bible. And so, we have a sacramental rite in Christianity. In Islam, it's the Quran. You'll hear it recited if you walk through villages or towns or whatever. It's recited. You hear it. And it's a book that they do recite. Those that memorize, they recite. Much of the Quran. It is essentially equivalent to the Christian sacrament, because there is no there's no real priesthood. There's no real services as we think about it in Christianity. There's obviously the act of worship, prayer, 5 times a day, as we'll talk about some of these things, but the idea of seeing, hearing, reciting the Quran is everything. Okay, it is the eternal word of God, of Allah. So it's God's everlasting, unchanging utterance, right? And so it's a focus of Muslim worship and the backdrop for everything in Islamic society. And like I said, because it covers essentially everything that you might do. It's like I said, you have a book almost as long as the New Testament. It's going to be that way. You're going to have that. So the desire of Muslims in the early years of Islam, when to comprehend and explicate the word of God, gave rise to the development of Arabic grammar. Okay, the pursuit of knowledge, and so that's what I've talked about that just briefly. Because of this, they were the ones that saved the great works of the classical world, and it also it strived to add to that, which they did. And so you have anybody do any astronomy around? Most of the stars that we see all have Arabic names. We know about they gave us what math, arithmetic, the numerals, we have those. They will, as I said, they will use that Greek knowledge. They will translate it into Arabic, and it is. I mean, they fill the Muslim world with this great knowledge, and in fact, some of the great scholars will come about in the 11th, 10th centuries. We'll talk about them in a minute. But and if you were in medicine, if you were sick in the Middle Ages, you wouldn't want a Christian doctor. Sorry, they'll kill you. They'll kill you. You want an Arabic doctor, because they had this. The Greeks were good at many things, much more than we probably know, based on some of the things that we have found recently of the things they created and knew. Astronomy was unbelievable knowledge in astronomy. Have you ever heard of the Antikythera device? Look it up sometime. Antikythera device. It's named after an island. It was something that some sponge divers found in the ocean. It's a big block. It looked like stone, but it was actually when they used a device to, whether it be electron, like an electron microscope, but something like that to determine what this was. It was something with hundreds of little wheels, and devices that kept track of the 5 major planets, Venus and Mars and Jupiter and Saturn and so on, would keep track of them over a period of hundreds of years. So in other words, if you stood in one place on a certain date and watched Jupiter rise over the horizon, the question is, how long would it be before? Remember, everything moves differently. Jupiter takes a long time to go around the sun, Earth much faster. But how long would it be before standing in the same place, you would see it do the same, come up in the same place? Usually it's like over 400 years. Okay, so how do you determine how long that is? Well, the Greeks knew, and they had this device that would tell you exactly how long that would happen and so on. That was very important to them. And it also shows a tremendous understanding of astronomical knowledge and so on. So they had this, and the Muslims picked up on that and had these things. The question is, what else did the Greeks know? I mean, this is unbelievable. It's one scientist said it's the Antikythera device is simple arithmetic, but it's a simple math, but it's and how it's put together is just immensely difficult. And so what else did they have that we don't know about? Then we'd have to say this is why the Muslims were able to do the things that they did with astronomy, with math, with science, with throughout medicine, literature, these kind of things that they would go through. And so and they preserved all this knowledge. And of course, the Quran is also believed to possess what's called barakah, the power and blessing of God. So they decorate their homes, their automobiles, offices, schools, commercial establishments, verses and copies of the writing of the Quran, doing it very beautifully, writing it out. And I talked about the Quranic reciters, those who memorize the whole thing. So the Quran has been compared with the Book of Mormon, but it's more like you would compare the Quran with the Doctrine and Covenants. Because, the Doctrine and Covenants is essentially kind of a how-to, right? In many ways, how-to book. The Quran is very much like that. And so the Quran is not a history. It's a collection of revelations, statements on many different subjects is what it's all about. And then also how the Quran has been organized is interesting. It's arranged from the longest to the shortest chapter. Chapters are called surahs. And so from the longest one, except the very first one, okay? The very first one says, in the name of Allah, the beneficent, the merciful, praise be, see, beneficent and the merciful. When you're merciful, that's compassion, right? That's a passion. So they emphasize that Allah does have love for his people. He is merciful to his people and so on. So in the name of Allah, the beneficent, the merciful, praise be to Allah, Lord of the worlds, the beneficent, the merciful, owner of the day of judgment. Thee alone we worship. Thee alone we ask for help. Show us the straight path, the path of those whom thou hast favored, not the path of those who earn thine anger, not of those who go astray. So that's the first one. Then after that, it goes into, it's kind of what people sometimes call it the Lord's Prayer of the Quran. So there's 114 surahs. The second one has 286 verses. That's a long chapter. And then it goes down from there, okay? Each one is just shorter than the one before. And the last one only has 3 verses, okay? And so it's, it is, I've read much of it. It is, like you said, reading the kind of the Doctrine and Covenants. And so they tried to, at the times they tried to put the surah kind of in sequence as how they were given to Muhammad. That's not been very successful. And so every surah, by the way, starts out with, in the name of Allah, the beneficent, the merciful. Okay, and then they have the surah. So comments, questions, questions on this so far? Any questions? Yeah.
About when would you say that in Islam, the trek from Mecca to Medina became something of a pilgrimage? I'm of the understanding that that is a pilgrimage that many followers of Islam in the Middle East do take as part of their.
They do, that's the Hajj, that and that, exactly when that began, it's sometime, after, obviously, after the death of Muhammad, and it's after the initial explosion, if you will, going through that. I mean, and it's described as, and it's the same thing in Christianity, Islam, it's the power of an idea. Okay, the power of an idea. And it's interesting that the idea comes to this idea, so to speak, this revelation, if you will, but the power of an idea comes to Muhammad just when things are just perfect, because the Persian and the Byzantine Empire have exhausted themselves with their wars with each other. And you have these, Muhammad is dead, but you have these men that are, interesting enough, tremendous generals, okay, and they explode out. There is, part of that is the old Arab desire for loot and plunder. It appears that there had been a great, climactic changes just before this happened. So there was great, the dearth of food and water and these kind of things, and so they have to go out. They go out, and their generalship seems excellent. They're able to defeat, being sometimes outnumbered by 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 to 1. These what's left of the empires, particularly the Persian Empire. They have a mode of transportation, which is the best in the world, fastest in the world. It's called the one hump camel. The camel is an amazing thing. It's very fast, goes a long ways with little food and little water. Okay, it goes a long ways, and so they're able to literally, surround an army very quickly without being seen. And I mean, they immediately, I mean, within a matter of a few years, all the way to the borders of China, all the way through to it takes them a while to get through the northwestern part of Africa, because they run into the Berbers, so a particularly violent tribe and so on. It takes them about 30 years to conquer them, and once they do conquer, they become Muslim. Okay, they accept the faith, and then they go into Spain. It takes them a while there, because Spain is, it's what's left of what little of the Roman Empire of theirs is still left. Takes them a while to conquer that. Then they move across the Pyrenees into Europe, and they run into a man by the name of Charles the Hammer Martel. One great name, isn't it? Charles the Hammer Martel. Charles the Hammer Martel is the grandfather of Charlemagne, very powerful warrior, and he puts a stop to it right there. So that stops that advance there, and it's the advance can go through Constantinople. They will not take that for another 800 years or so, and so they never get really into Europe. But it's the power of an idea, and so after this, then you begin then of course you have this desire to go to the place where these events occurred. You want to go to the Kaaba. See, and Muhammad will change it. The idols are gone that are in there. The treaties, some of those may still be there, but it becomes a very sacred place, a place where Ishmael first lived, and after being he and his mother cast out, and so it becomes a very sacred place. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Hajj and so on in a minute. But in any case, just to get a little more information on Allah, he does have 7 characteristics. He is the God, just one, the God. First, he is absolute unity or oneness, absolutely monotheistic. Okay, no question, absolutely monotheistic. He's all seeing, all hearing, all speaking, all knowing, and all willing. His purposes, any purpose he has, will be accomplished, no question. and he is all powerful. And so it's, then the question becomes, and there's a question within Islam that has been there for a very long time, this theological discussion about free will and God's determinism. Do you have free will? Is there free will in Islam, in that belief? If God has determined everything, I think it's Al-Ghazali later on, one of the things he said, if I pick up this phone, as I pick up this phone and go up and down, it's not me doing this. It's God doing this. It's Allah. Everything that happens, everything that's done is done by God. If he's absolutely all powerful, then every action I do is done by Allah. But you see where that leads is then, all right, so do I have free will? And many believe, no, it's fate. You'll hear that used often. It's fate. You hear some of that, and of course, as we talked about some of the religions of the Far East, you really don't have any free will. Everything you do has been ordained by Allah. And so some of the things that we see in the modern faith when in battle, or and especially with some of the terrorist ideas, is that if that's true, how do you fight that? In other words, if you take a plane and fly it into a building, I didn't do that. Allah did that. And so there's this argument later on in Islam by some of these scholars about how much free will do I have. Many believe that you still have free will. Again, there's of course different sects of Islam, and we'll talk about the two main ones here in a second. But but so there's quite, and it is a fascinating. I mean, it's not just in Islam. There's many places where we argue how much free will do we have. Of course, in Christianity and so on, we believe there's, that's where the idea of, right, wrong, punishment, whatever comes from, is that we are responsible for the actions that we take and the thoughts even that we think. In Islam, there is no idea of punishment for thoughts. It's only for actions. But then if I have no free will, then there would be no punishment, right? Because it's not me doing it, it's Allah who does it. So that's one of the things that's come up in Islam over the years, and it brought some tremendous philosophical ideas and thoughts. Do you have a comment or question?
I have a question. Because Muhammad comes from the lineage of Abraham.
Yes.
But how are new prophets? How do they become prophets?
Well, you don't have,
Because they call themselves prophets, because they were on the radio and on the TV.
Oh, you're talking about
Islam.
modern day?
Yeah.
Well, what you have that's sometimes you have that.
They're self-proclaimed prophets.
Yeah, you'll have, and that's in the Sunni, the Shia belief is the idea of it's imams. And we'll talk about that in a minute. You have the two great different, you have some different ideas and different groups within Islam, but the two great divisions are Sunni and Shia. And Sunni is about 85% of Islam, and Shia is about 15%. And if you think in terms of Shia, well, Shia is Iran, and the ones that like Hezbollah, Hamas, some of these others. There is no love lost between these two. If Islam is really in danger, or whatever, they will join forces. But otherwise, they have fought each other over many centuries. So you have imams. You really don't have any prophets, so-called, after Muhammad, but you do have these great scholars. The imams are in the Shia, and you've heard that name used a lot. Recently, there's many of them have called for jihad. In the modern term of jihad. The question about jihad is whether that was what it originally meant, and when does it enter the idea, when it enters the Quran. Some say it was only later, some earlier, but the idea is, some say it only means to struggle. It's like the Greek word agon means to struggle, to do what you need to do, what you should do. And jihad may mean that, but obviously for some, and it means to essentially take up arms against those you believe to be your enemies, to kill. And so what was the original meaning? Many believe it was just to struggle, to become what Allah would want you to become, that type of thing. And so, but yeah, there's some that may call themselves prophets, but they're certainly not going to say that they are prophets like Muhammad. They may be great scholars, and they, of course, again, there's differences of opinion between them, those and others, and like I said, no love lost between Sunni and Shia. We'll talk about that in a minute, where those come from. It just comes down to who takes authority from Muhammad afterwards. And you've heard of caliphs, right? Caliphs is the Sunni tradition with Abu Bakr, who was essentially Muhammad's right-hand man, Abu Bakr, and then his successors, who really they are called the caliphs. And you have the caliphate. You've heard about restoring the caliphate. But Sunni was the idea was, or excuse me, Shia. Tell you a story. I took, when I was working on my master's, I took a long course in Islam. When it came down to the final exam, I wrote quite a long exam, and I just switched the two. I explained Shia as Sunni and Sunni as Shia. And the professor, she realized very quickly when she was reading my test, and gave me the grade I thought I should have anyway, which was a good grade. But when I went up to her, she says, "I know you know the difference. I know you know what I mean. You explained it perfectly. You just switched the names." And so I still do that. But Shia is one who follows in the actual tradition of Muhammad's actual family. So through his daughter, through husband and their child, and then, but that child will die, or that person will die later, and then there's no other descendants. So they're looking for the hidden imam, the one, and that's, you'll hear that often in Iran, the hidden imam who is supposed to come back and will be revealed. And so they do have these imams, these great scholars, and but it's confusing to us because you have these two different types, and so we'll see. But in any case, one says, this idea of free will. There is a passage in the Quran which says that there is no compulsion in religion, meaning there's free will. Okay. On the other hand, there are some passages, that say God determines all things. So which is it? And so, when you says God determines all things, you've heard probably, if God wills, okay, this will happen if God wills. And you hear that often. Inshallah, if God wills, which means that pretty much there really is no free will, no real determination for us, but it's only if God wills. It will come in much later with the great Muslim scholars. This will be a subject of tremendous, it's fascinating reading, if you like that sort of thing. Very fascinating. And by the way, this is not something that's relegated just to Islam. Christian scholars will do the same thing, and look at this. People like, Thomas Aquinas and some of these others. Thomas Aquinas, 2 large volumes like this. It's great stuff, but you don't want to read it when you're tired. Or maybe you do, and it'll put you right out. Okay. It'll put you right out. But it's great stuff. So I've already talked about, where they go. So Muhammad had died, as I mentioned, very suddenly, and he didn't officially name a successor. And this is where you get he had, many believe that it should be, succession should be hereditary, or, the successor, the caliph would be the successor, chosen from among those that were with them. And so that's where you get, as I mentioned, the Shiites and the Sunnis. And so Ali was the the successor to Muhammad, you know, his would have been his son-in-law, if I get that right. And yeah, he's, you know, he married his daughter Fatima, and you've probably heard that name before, Fatima, and married her. And so so you have those, you know, Ali was connected to Muhammad by marriage, but Abu Bakr, and by the way, Abu Bakr, so they both have kind of the same claim, because Abu Bakr, his daughter was Aisha, who married Muhammad. And therefore, you know, you have this line that comes down as far as his family, Muhammad's family, and his daughter and son-in-law and so on, but that's Abu Bakr's daughter. So you have this kind of connection. And this is the problem. This is some of the problem. They both seem to have this connection close to the Prophet. In any case, Abu Bakr became the first caliph, and it would remain in Sunni hands down to the somewhat present day, though they don't really have a caliph. Because what will happen in you know, as time goes on, especially as the, and this is normal, it happens throughout history, that you have this great, really magnificent empire. And as time goes on, it begins to, you know, you have the infighting and you have these things, and it begins, and usually the infighting occurs because these people, these Muslims over here aren't living the Quran as they should. They aren't living the precepts, the hadith, which is the teachings of Muhammad that really aren't contained in the Quran, hadith. And so they're not living that. And so you have these battles between Muslims. And so slowly this so-called empire begins to break apart, and it will last down to the present day, but it breaks apart and they begin to fight each other. And so it goes down. When they talk about and of course they are mostly in this part of the world, in North Africa, Middle East, and then further east, you know, towards in India, or towards India. But particularly in the Middle East, and they are no longer the great empire. They are, you know, they've broken down. They don't have, they've been a slow downhill trend to where they are at the time. They break up and get into tribes and so on. But Islam is still there, but then the you know, places like France, Great Britain, later the United States get involved in the Middle East. Why? What are we looking for in the Middle East? Oil, yeah, oil, and that's where a lot of it. And so they come in, and you know, I mean, they consider that a great incursion into what is theirs. And so and of course the question then becomes, as they're looking at it, is why is it that you have these great countries, you know, the very powerful great countries, and Islam has become much more weak, and they're not great, and they're having these problems. Why is that true if this is the true religion? Islam is the true religion. And so they look at it, well, if Islam is a true religion, and certainly they believe it is, then particularly the United States and England, France, must be the great Satan. Okay. And that's where that term comes from. It's looked at from the point of view, it's a religious point of view, and it's understandable. There were, I'm sure, many things that happened there that, you know, when you're looking for oil, when you're looking for these kind of things, I'm sure there's some things that happen that probably shouldn't have, but in any case, it does. And so that's where that idea comes from. Now, as far as, you know, when they talk about, you know, obviously the Jews have been in the Middle East there since the time of Abraham. And of course, then you have the great problem that both of these great peoples are descended from the same man, okay? Different wives, but different mothers, but the same man. And of course, so Abraham is about 1800 BC. The Arabs, you know, this form with Muhammad is about, again, the 7th century or so AD, so it's much later. Both of them have a claim, of course. They both claim this part of the world, and particularly Jerusalem. But you know, so that's another reason why they look for that. And you know, you hear today the word colonizer and these kind of things. Who's colonizing whom? And of course that the great problems they have with these great Western countries. There may be some obviously some truth to that, but this is where you have a lot of this that you hear in the present day. It's a very complex situation and very volatile as we've seen, right? Very volatile. So and of course only in the last, because of oil and these kind of things, it's only lately that these things have, these countries have begun to, I mean, there's, was it 37, 38 countries that are essentially Muslim, mostly in Africa, Middle East, so on. 37. There's a lot of, it's a billion, and of course you have Muslims throughout the world. And so it's, and of course I talked about Hadith, the sayings of the prophet, and what would the prophet do, so to speak? How would he handle these things? And that's where you get of these hadith, the traditions of Muhammad. This is where you get the law that is called Sharia. Sharia law, you've heard of that? Okay, Sharia law. And so it's, it's not really a legal code, but it's not something, of course, that's, you've had even some judges in the West and even in the United States that have tried to, bring Sharia law into their decisions. Sorry, it doesn't work that way. Judges are only supposed to use the Constitution. They can't use Sharia law. But, and so it deals with, crimes, inheritance, marriage, divorce, how to pray, fasting, etiquette, all of these things is Sharia law. And so all of them, those that pick it up will pick up that. It is in that the culture, as far as the culture of Islam, they've brought in a lot of things. They picked up Jewish legends, Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, Persian manners. And so you have, you had great lawyers, mystics, skeptics, poets, a great culture. I mean, it is a great culture in many ways. And so we won't deal with the Sufis, which is a particular sect. Don't have time for that, but we want to talk about the 5 pillars of Islam, right? Those are the basic, and it's, by the way, it's really in many ways a very basic, simple religion. It's not like Judaism, which tends to be rather complex in many ways. But the first pillar is the profession of faith. You've all heard it. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger. That's essentially it. It's a very simple way to join, to become a Muslim is the profession of faith and the practice. And there you are. Second pillar is salat, which is prayer. Can be done anywhere 5 times a day, at least. Okay, 5 times a day. And it involves, physical movements, this idea performed usually in a mosque, but it can be done anywhere, you want to do it in the mosque. And so it's a place what's called essentially a place of bowing, because they do the bowing. And you have a mihrab, which is a niche that you would pray in that direction towards the niche, the mihrab, which is the direction of Mecca, okay, and Medina, those 2 places. So we do that. And of course, they have the big minarets where they go up. These days they use big amplified, recorded calls, but it used to be they'd get somebody up and they call you to prayer. The third pillar is the zakat, almsgiving, care for the poor. Some places even tax people their alms, they tax them, their tax for their alms, and it's for the poor. And usually it's about 2.5% of the person's income. Boy, I wish our taxes were only 2.5%, don't you? Fourth pillar is fasting, al-Sawm. But it's a different type of fast. We church, we fast once a month, and or other times if necessary, but this is usually once a month. or the month of Ramadan. You've probably heard of that, Ramadan, and it is a fast. Okay, the fast lasts an entire month. Okay, and you don't. It says it begins daily when it is light enough to distinguish the difference between a black and a white thread, and ends in the evening when it is no longer possible to make that distinction. So it's all day, and during the night people may eat, but during the day you do not eat or drink. You don't indulge in sexual contact. It is so that the night, when the night comes, it's a good time. And the fifth pillar, of course, is the pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj. They don't really have a, I know it had to have been sometime after this great expansion, but as far as an exact date, I don't know that they really, it probably started out very small and became bigger and bigger and bigger, and it makes perfect sense that they wanted to go to the place where all of this began. And so it's a time of reformation of the Abrahamic covenants, repentance, forgiveness, purification, before God. The high point, there's something you want to do the Hajj at least once in your life. You can do short ones, but you want to do the full Hajj, and I can I'll give you some of the things, because it is the we won't go over a lot of these other things. Well, we can get some of that, but you want to go at least once, and it involves, we don't really have time to go through all of the things that it involves, but because it can cover about 2 weeks that you're there, and it's to purify yourself, to grow closer to Allah, to fast, to pray, and it's considered something to be able, there's a circumambulation of the Kaaba. It's considered really the high point in anybody's life. If you can do the Hajj just once, it's considered a great thing, and so you really want to do that. As I mentioned, Jesus accept Jesus as a prophet, having been, having been born of a virgin. He's mentioned several times in the Quran. They speak of him as the Word of God. So he's speaking these things, but they expect him to come back at the end of time, and they believe that his crucifixion was only an illusion of the Jews. And so they don't believe he died on the cross, was not resurrected, atones for no one's sins, and is not the Son of God. Allah has no sons. Okay. Only Allah is God. Let's see if there's a few other things. There's some connections, interesting enough, between the books of Abraham and Moses and some of the things in the Quran. Okay, some places in the Quran. And so it's interesting where you have some of this. Exactly why there would be these things. Well, they're ancient volumes, ancient books, and of course, we forget sometimes that we know as members of the church that the gospel was taught from the beginning. We don't realize that a religion has been everything to every people, and it's taught from the beginning. We don't know much of that because much of those records are lost. Most of them are lost, and some have to be replaced, by or re-given to us. Others we do find now and then, but it's been around for a long time, so it wouldn't be unusual to find elements that would be the same in both these faces or these places. They do believe in a physical resurrection, and something that you mentioned as far as prophets. There are 28 prophets mentioned in the Quran, but these are ones there's 18 that we know of that are also mentioned in the Old Testament. But there's some others that aren't, but these are ones that usually occurred. They were prophets anciently before the Quran was given. And so Muhammad is the last of the prophets. Remember, we talked about the seal of the prophets. And so Latter-day Saints, of course, we look at Joseph Smith. We believe prophets are necessary. We need prophets all the time, constantly. And because otherwise, when we don't have prophets, Well, even when we do have prophets, we don't always do well, but certainly we don't do well when you don't have it, obviously, human nature being what it is, we're constantly fighting, are we not? As I've mentioned before, talking to my students, I say, history is not pretty most of the time. But now and then you have these bright spots. And so, there's only one prophet as far as the Quran is concerned, which was Muhammad. But Joseph Smith is the first of the modern prophets, and we believe we have prophets from this time on. Till the Lord comes, you do have a messianic figure in Islam, one called the Mahdi, Mahdi, the Mahdi. There's been several that have come about that they thought might be the Mahdi, but not that. And so both Joseph Smith, Muhammad believe they were divinely called to receive patriarchal religion, the patriarchal religion of Abraham. Their father Abraham both taught that their followers were literal blood descendants of Father Abraham. We're either literal descendants or we're adopted in, you see, to that. And of course, the Jews, literal descendants. Interesting, you have most of the world's belief as far as religion. Abraham plays an important part. Obviously, we are descendants of. In modern day Christianity, not so much. They don't look at that as that they are literal descendants of many of them, but we understand, as I mentioned, talking about Judaism and some of these others, Joseph Smith understood that the promises that God makes to Abraham in ancient times have to be the same promises we have today. They have to be. If he made those promises, the blessings of Abraham, were to be all the nations of the world, all the peoples of the world would be blessed in Abraham. And so it's not surprising that you have three great religions talking about Abraham and the blessings there. Again, Protestant Christianity, not so much. Though they understand that, they don't understand it fully. But it's interesting that you have Abraham as that center of these three great religions, and how the nations of the world would be blessed. And so Arabs, literal descendants of Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn son. The Jews, descendants of Jacob. Many people today are descendants of Abraham, knowingly or unknowingly. Others, Joseph Smith says, if you're not, then in order for all the people of the world to receive the blessings of Abraham, you have to be adopted in. And we believe in adoption. That's what's called baptism, and those kind of things, joining the church. So Muslim and Latter-day Saints comparisons are, wide-ranging, but and so we're just beginning to see some of these things, and we don't really know, because those that, the ones we hear from all the time are those that are what many would call the terrorists, but there's hundreds of millions of Muslims in the world that, just follow just what we've talked about. They just want to live their faith and their belief and have the freedom to do so. And they, you find that when you meet them, they tend to be very kind, just like anybody else. And so it's, if you have many that are these terrorist types, you have many more that are the people who just, they want to be accepted for their beliefs. Don't we all? Right? Don't we all? And certainly members of the church, not so much today, but in the past, understood what it was like to be persecuted, right? Driven from place to place. And so we can understand that, and we should have It's, they, back, and I'll finish with this, but not too long ago, there was a great outreach in the church to Muslims, and that still continues. A lot of it happened in the late 80s into the 90s. It still continues, and of course, we're seeing much of outreach to the Christian churches, but also to Muslims in different parts of the world, because obviously, there's disagreements on basic tenets of religion, but there's also the idea that we are all the children of God, descendants in one way, form, shape, or another of Abraham, our father. So, our physical father. Yeah. In any case, I say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, let me